The price dropped 3 times before anyone raised a hand. It was a Thursday morning in March of 2001, and the auctioneer was standing beside a Massey Ferguson 3090 that had been sitting at the back of a dispersal sale in Benton County, Indiana, for 2 hours without attracting serious interest. The machine had been brought in last, after the combines and the planter and the newer tractors, in the way that auctioneers bring in the difficult lots. At the end, when the crowd is tired and the serious money has already been spent, and the people still standing are the ones who came to pick up something cheap or go home with nothing. The opening bid was $8,000. Silence. The auctioneer dropped to $6,000. A man near the fence offered $5,000. The auctioneer worked the crowd for a competing bid. Nothing. He dropped to $4,500. Still nothing. $4,000. The man near the fence shook his head and walked away. $3,200. From the back of the crowd, a hand went up. The hand belonged to a 38-year-old farmer named Daniel Pruitt. He had 360 acres of corn and soybean ground in Warren County, a farm he had been working alone since his wife Carol took a teaching position in Williamsport that kept her in town 5 days a week. He had come to the sale looking for a tillage tractor, something to pull his chisel plow and his field cultivator without putting strain on his primary machine, which was a 1998 Massey Ferguson 6180 that he'd bought used 2 years earlier and was already carrying more hours than he was comfortable with for a tractor that had no backup behind it. He had not planned to spend more than $4,000. $3,200 was under budget. He raised his hand, the auctioneer pointed, and nobody else moved. Sold. Daniel walked to the cashier's table and wrote the check. He borrowed a trailer from the man next to him in line, a farmer he'd met twice at the elevator who happened to be going back toward Warren County, and said Daniel was welcome to hitch behind his truck. They loaded the Massey Ferguson, drove south, and Daniel unloaded it in his machine shed in the late afternoon. He stood in the shed looking at what he'd bought. The machine was a 1988 model with the hour meter showing 9,400. The paint was weathered down to primer in places. The cab had a crack in the left window that had been taped from the inside with electrical tape. One hydraulic hose was wrapped in duct tape over what appeared to be a previous leak repair. The previous owner, a farmer named Howard Kessle, who had been selling everything after his wife's illness forced the family to move closer to Indianapolis, had described the tractor at the auction as needing work without specifying what work. Daniel understood. He had bought needing work before. He knew what it meant. It meant the machine ran, or had recently run, but had problems that the seller either couldn't diagnose correctly, couldn't afford to fix, or didn't want to disclose in detail in a public auction setting. It meant the buyer was purchasing uncertainty alongside the machine, and the price was supposed to compensate for the uncertainty. $3,200 was adequate compensation, in Daniel's view, for whatever needing work turned out to mean. He had the tools and the knowledge and the time to find out. He would find out on Saturday, when the week's field work was done and the shed was available for the kind of focused inspection that a machine with an unknown history required. He went inside. He did not know what Saturday would find. Daniel Pruitt had grown up around equipment the way farm children grow up around it, by proximity, by necessity, by the specific education that comes from watching a problem get solved and then solving it yourself the next time it appears. His father had farmed 600 acres in Fountain County and had maintained his own equipment because the alternative was dependency on a dealership that was 40 minutes away and not always available when availability was required. By the time Daniel took over his own farm in 1990, he could rebuild a hydraulic pump, diagnose an injection system problem from the exhaust characteristics, and read a diesel engine's condition from the oil on the dipstick with the specific literacy of someone who has been reading dipsticks since he was 12. He was not a trained mechanic. He was something more specific than that. A farmer who understood his machines the way a farmer understands his fields, through accumulated observation that no classroom could have produced. The Massey Ferguson 3090 sat in his shed through the week. On Saturday morning, Daniel was in the shed at 6 o'clock with his toolbox and his service manual and a pad of paper for notes. He started with the basics: oil level, coolant, hydraulic fluid, fuel filters. Everything looked older than it should have, but cleaner than the machine's general appearance suggested. The oil was dark but not contaminated. The coolant was recent. The hydraulic fluid had been changed within the last year, based on its color and clarity. He started the engine. It turned over on the second crank, which was better than he had expected from a machine that had been sitting in a sale lot for who knew how long. It ran rough for 30 seconds. He let it warm. The roughness diminished but did not entirely disappear. There was a slight irregularity in the idle that suggested something in the fuel system. Possibly an injector, possibly the pump itself. He let it run for 20 minutes and listened. The irregularity was consistent. It was not getting worse. He checked the exhaust, slight blue tinge, not heavy, not the black smoke of a seriously worn engine. He checked the gauges. Oil pressure was good, temperature was normal. He shut it down. Then he did what he always did with an unknown machine. He went under the hood and started looking at everything he could see without disassembling anything. He was looking at the injection pump bracket when he noticed the envelope. It was tucked between the injection pump and the firewall, held in place by the pump bracket itself, as if someone had slipped it there deliberately, and then the bracket had been reinstalled over it, pinning it without crushing it. The envelope was yellowed and slightly greasy from proximity to the engine, but intact. Daniel worked it free carefully. His name was not on it. Nothing was on it. He opened it. Inside were 11 pages of folded paper, service records, parts receipts, and a single handwritten note on ruled paper. Daniel unfolded everything and spread it on the hood of the tractor and read it in the morning light coming through the shed door. The service records were from a Massey Ferguson dealer in Covington, dated between April of 1997 and November of 1999. They documented a complete engine rebuild. New pistons, new rings, new main bearings, new rod bearings, a rebuilt cylinder head, new injectors, a rebuilt injection pump, a new turbocharger. The total on the receipts came to $16,340. The handwritten note was from Howard Kessle. It said, "Whoever gets this tractor, I rebuilt this engine in 1997 because I thought I was going to farm it for another 20 years. I didn't get to. The engine has less than 2,000 hours on it since the rebuild. I didn't tell the auctioneer because I didn't want to get into it. The records are real. The dealer is Watsika Implement in Covington. You can call them and verify. Take care of it. It deserves it." Daniel read the note twice. Then he read the service records twice. Then he stood beside the Massey Ferguson 3090 in the early morning light and understood what he had bought. He called Watsika Implement on Monday morning. He asked for the service department. He gave them the tractor's serial number and asked if they had records of a rebuild in 1997. The service manager put him on hold for 4 minutes. When he came back, he confirmed the records. The rebuild had been done in their shop. The parts were genuine Massey Ferguson components. The work had been performed by their senior mechanic who had been with the dealership for 19 years. The total was $16,340, paid by Howard Kessle in 2 installments. Daniel thanked the service manager and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a while. Then he called Carol at the school where she taught. He told her what he'd found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you paid $3,200 for a machine with a $16,000 engine in it?" Daniel said, "That's about right." Carol said, "And nobody at the auction knew." Daniel said, "Howard Kessle knew." He put the records in an envelope and tucked them behind the injection pump bracket. Carol said, "Why didn't he just tell the auctioneer?" Daniel said he'd been thinking about that. He said, "I think Howard didn't want to watch that machine get bid up by people who were only interested in what it was worth on paper. I think he wanted it to go to someone who would find the records after they'd already committed to the machine. Someone who bought it for the right reasons, even before they knew what was inside it." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a strange way to think about selling a tractor." Daniel said, "I think Howard was a strange way of thinking about farming. He meant it as a compliment. It was the highest compliment Daniel Pruitt knew how to pay. The irregularity in the idol turned out to be a single injector that was slightly out of calibration. Not failing, not worn, just drifted from specification the way injectors drift over time and use. Daniel had it recalibrated at a shop in Attica for $80. After the recalibration, the engine ran clean. The idle was smooth. There was no blue smoke, no roughness, no hesitation under load. He put the tractor to work in the spring of 2001. It pulled his 12-foot chisel plow through ground that had been wet all winter and was slow to dry. Four-wheel drive engaging cleanly in the corners where the field drained poorly and the soil stayed soft longer than the rest. He finished spring tillage 5 days ahead of schedule, which meant 5 days earlier into planting, which meant 5 days of the planting window that his primary tractor hadn't burned on secondary work. The Massey Ferguson 3090 paid for itself in that first spring. Not literally, $3,200 and an $80 injector calibration against 5 days of recovered planning time is not a calculation that reduces to a clean number. But in the way that the right piece of equipment pays for itself, by doing the work it was purchased to do, without requiring the attention and expense and downtime that the wrong piece of equipment extracts across the seasons. He kept the envelope. He put it in the filing cabinet in his farm office, in the folder where he kept equipment documentation. He told 2 people about it. Carol, on the phone the day he called the dealer, and his neighbor, Jim Alcott, who came to the shed one evening in April to look at a hydraulic fitting on his own machine and asked about the 3090. Daniel told him the story. Jim listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Jim said, "You think Howard Kessle did that on purpose? Hid the records so whoever got it would have to earn them first?" Daniel said, "I don't think Howard thought about it in those terms. I think Howard was a man who rebuilt an engine because the work deserved to be done right, and then had to sell everything and felt bad about the machine going cheap and wanted whoever got it to understand what they had." Jim said, "And you do understand what you have?" Daniel said, "I'm starting to." The years that followed were the years of an operation finding its level. Daniel farmed his 360 acres carefully, expanded to 440 in 2004, when a parcel adjacent to his north field came available at a price that his accounting said was right, and managed the operation with the specific discipline of a man who has learned that the margin between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't is thinner than most people outside farming understand. The Massey Ferguson 3090 was in the field every season. Spring tillage, fall chisel work, pulling wagons during harvest when his combine was moving faster than his primary tractor could keep up. It accumulated hours on the rebuilt engine. Not quickly, because a tillage tractor on a 400-acre operation doesn't run the hours that a primary machine runs, but steadily. By 2005, the engine had 3,500 hours on it since the rebuild. By 2008, 4,800. Daniel maintained it the way the receipts in the envelope suggested. Howard Kessle had maintained the machine before the rebuild. Oil every 100 hours, filters on schedule, hydraulic fluid changed on the service interval. Nothing deferred because deferring was cheaper in the moment and more expensive across the years. He kept his own service log for the machine and kept it in the same filing cabinet as Howard's envelope, the 2 documents together forming a continuous record of a machine that had been cared for by 2 different men across 20 years. In 2007, he replaced the hydraulic hose that had been wrapped in duct tape since the day he bought the machine. He found when he removed the tape that the hose underneath had been patched over a small cut rather than replaced, the kind of repair that holds under normal pressure but is a failure waiting to happen under load. He replaced the hose and noted in his service log, "Original hose, taped repair, replaced with new. Parts cost $42. He felt better about the machine after that, the way you feel better about a thing when you have addressed the one known uncertainty that was left in it. He did not think often about Howard Kessle, but he thought about him sometimes, in the way that you think about a person whose decision shaped something in your life without either of you having planned it. Howard had rebuilt an engine he couldn't afford to lose and then lost everything else and put the records in an envelope and tucked the envelope behind a bracket and driven the machine to a sale and said nothing. And Daniel had stood in the back of the crowd when the price dropped to $3,200 and raised his hand for a machine he had not inspected and had driven it home and found what Howard had left him. The chain of that, the rebuild, the records, the envelope, the bracket, the auction, the hand, was not planned by anyone. It had assembled itself from the separate decisions of two men who had never met, and it had produced something that neither of them could have designed. A machine, cared for continuously, across two ownerships in 20 years, that was running as well in 2009 as it had run when the dealer in Covington buttoned up the engine in the fall of 1997. Daniel found Howard Kessle in 2009. He had not looked for him. He had been in Indianapolis for a farm equipment conference and had seen the name in a program, Howard Kessle, retired, formerly of Benton County, speaking briefly on a panel about family farm transitions. Daniel waited until after the panel and introduced himself. Howard was 73. He was thin and moved carefully, the way men move when their joints have opinions about distance. He looked at Daniel for a moment when Daniel said his name and then said, "The 3090. Daniel said, "Yes." Howard said, "You found the envelope." Daniel said, "Behind the injection pump bracket." "I called Watsika Implement to verify." Howard nodded slowly. He said, "How is it running?" Daniel said, 11 years and it hasn't missed a day of work. I've put 5,000 hours on the rebuilt engine. It runs as clean now as when I bought it." Howard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know what I was going to do with those records. I didn't want to disclose them at the sale because I knew the price would go up and it would end up with someone who was just looking for the value. I wanted it to go to someone who would find out what it was after they'd already decided they wanted it." Daniel said, "I raised my hand at 3,200. I didn't know what was in it." Howard said, "I know. That's why I left the records for you." Daniel said, "You couldn't have known I'd raise my hand." Howard said, "No. But whoever raised their hand last, when the price was at the bottom, was the person I wanted to have it. Someone who saw something in the machine before they knew what it was worth. That's the person who was going to take care of it." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "I have your records in my filing cabinet, your handwritten note too." Howard said, "Keep them." Daniel said, "I will." They shook hands. Daniel drove back to Warren County. He went to the shed when he got home and started the Massey Ferguson 3090 and let it idle in the shed for a few minutes, the way he sometimes did when he had been away and wanted to confirm it was still what it had been when he left. It was still what it had been. The engine was smooth, the idle was even. The gauges were where they were supposed to be. He shut it down and put his hand on the hood for a moment, the way you put your hand on something that has earned a kind of respect that the hand understands better than words do. Then he went inside. The Massey Ferguson 3090 is still on Daniel Pruitt's farm. It is 36 years old. The engine that Howard Kessle paid $16,340 to rebuild in 1997 has accumulated nearly 9,000 hours since that work was done. Daniel has never opened it beyond routine maintenance. The injectors were replaced in 2014. The turbocharger was rebuilt in 2017. The injection pump was overhauled in 2019. Everything else is original to the rebuild. Daniel is 61 years old now. His son Matthew farms alongside him, learning the operation the way Daniel learned his father's, by proximity, by necessity, by the specific education of watching a problem get solved and then solving it yourself. Matthew has heard the story of the envelope. He knows what the records say. He keeps the filing cabinet organized the way Daniel taught him. The envelope is still there. Howard's note is still there, yellowed further with the years, the handwriting faded but legible. Whoever gets this tractor, the dealer is Watsika Implement. You can call them and verify. Take care of it. It deserves it. Matthew asked his father once what the lesson of the story was. Daniel said he didn't think of it as a story with a lesson. He thought of it as a record of two decisions. Howard's decision to rebuild the engine when he could have run the machine until it failed, and Daniel's decision to raise his hand at the bottom of the price because the machine looked like something worth the uncertainty. Matthew said, and both decisions turned out to be right. Daniel said, both decisions were right before they turned out to be anything. Howard didn't know he was going to lose the farm when he rebuilt the engine. He rebuilt it because it was the right thing to do with a machine he was responsible for. And I didn't know what was in the envelope when I raised my hand. I raised my hand because the machine looked like it was worth $3,200, even if the answer to needing work was expensive. Matthew said, so the hidden rebuild didn't change anything. Daniel looked at him. He said, it confirmed everything. That's different from changing it. Matthew thought about that for a while. Then he went back to the machine he'd been working on. Daniel watched him go and thought about a Thursday morning in March of 2001, and a price dropping 3 times, and a hand going up in the back of a crowd, and an envelope behind an injection pump bracket. Howard Kessle had been right. The person who raised their hand last was the person who should have had it, and the machine, maintained across 2 ownerships and 24 years, was still proving it every season.